Good evening, welcome to Bourne Environmental Review. My name is Phil Goddard, and it's hard to believe I've been doing this show now since 1997. In the course of that period of time, there has been one project that I've had a focus on, and in fact was the first show that I ever did, which is the cleanup at what was then called the Massachusetts Military Reservation. It was now what is now called Joint Base Cape Cod. This is a major cleanup in New England, in the country, let alone Cape Cod. And the reason this is so important for us that live in the town of Bourne and the Upper Cape generally is that we have a sole source aquifer where groundwater is our primary source of drinking water. In fact, the only source of drinking water on the Upper Cape. This is a large cleanup. It's complex, but after over 25 years, maybe pushing 30 years of various parties involved in the cleanup, it has evolved over time. Systems have been put in place. And what we're here tonight going to discuss is specifically what is going on with the Installation Restoration Program, part of the cleanup, which is traditionally the Air Force side of the cleanup, in the town of Bourne, how Bourne has been affected over the years. Some new information has come along, and kind of give you, the viewer, an essence of what is the cleanup, how it's being addressed, and for those in the communities in Pecasset that are affected by a recent discovery, we want you to understand the history behind the program so you have a context as to what is occurring in your neighborhoods and how the Air Force is addressing your concerns. So to discuss all of this tonight, I have two guests who have a lot of experience with this military base in these issues for a long time, and it's going to be a great pleasure to speak with both of them about their knowledge and what they're doing in the community in Bourne to address your concerns. First to my right is Rose Forbes, who's the Remediation Program Manager of the Installation Restoration Program at Joint Base Cape Cod for the Air Force Engineering Center.
That's right.
Okay, so it's changed over the years. Welcome, Rose. Rose is the lead project manager for the whole Air Force side of the cleanup, which is the majority of the cleanup and has a lot of history. Joining her to her right is Doug Karson, the community involvement lead, also of Joint Base Cape Cod Air Force Civil Engineer Center. Doug, welcome.
Thanks,
and
Phil.
You've been with the base for a long time as well. So Rose, if you could just give us a brief overview what your position is when you came to the program on Cape Cod.
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having us. Let's see. I got here in 1999, January. I remember it was very snowy and a beautiful area. And I started working in the program as a project engineer and been there ever since, taking on more, I guess, increasingly complex roles leading up to the remediation program manager. So,
Almost 20 years coming up.
yeah, it is.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, not as long as
Right.
Doug Karson here.
So you're an engineer,
Yes.
civil engineer,
Chemical.
chemical engineer. This is perfect for some of the discussions we're going to have. So you started out as a staff person in the RPM Remediation Program Manager. What is that role?
Right. So I'm responsible for the Air Force Installation Restoration Program, as you noted earlier, but that includes programming, including doing contracts, getting the funding, but it also includes a technical side, reviewing reports and such, creating a schedule for the program, and answering any kind of the different questions that we get, and just making sure that we're responsive. And it's just program management. It's
all the
it's
details.
different. It's different every day.
So we might remember, those of you watching, back in the 1980 time frame, there was an infamous Superfund site. It wasn't called Superfund at the time. It was a national crisis where schools and homes were built on top of a chemical waste dump in upstate New York at an old abandoned canal that was built in the 19th century, abandoned and filled in with dirt and drums from a chemical company. And that turned out to be called Love Canal.
Yeah.
And that became a national crisis that Jimmy Carter responded to and created the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, aka Superfund. That responded to these abandoned chemical and other contaminated sites. And so it's something that we're used to now, but really, it's fairly recent in history. And there is a lot. So the community was outraged. Let's clean this up. Let's get on it. And then there was a law created, and then taxes put on petroleum products to put in a fund to clean up this. And then now what? Okay, you're the now what, in the sense that a program gets established, responsible parties are identified, a budget's created. In this case, it's the federal government. But then you've got to hire contractors. You've got to go to the community and do all the thousands and thousands of tens of thousands of individual tasks to actually do a cleanup, which is an enormous challenge when you're dealing with pollution that's gone into the groundwater. We'll explain what a plume is in a minute.
Right.
Doug, you've been with the program since the mid-'80s, I think around 1986.
Right.
It started out, I believe, as a National Guard response. Maybe you give us a little history about
Yeah, I
the
showed up
program.
in the spring of 1985, Phil. First of all, I want to thank you, Phil, for having us on the show, and also for your dedicated service over the last 20-plus years. You've been
Thank you.
really valuable to the community here in Bourne, and also to us, the military. For those who don't know Phil's background, he served many years on the public information team, numerous meetings, and then it kind of transitioned into other forms, but he's still involved, and he deserves a lot of credit.
Thank you
for the
very
work he's
much.
done. As far as the program goes, as I said, I started in '85. The cleanup program began in 1982, just for the Air National Guard, about 3,200 acres. In 1984, it was expanded to include Camp Edwards and the Coast Guard properties, so pretty much the entire military reservation at that time. Now it's called Joint Base Cape Cod. And as you said, over the years, it eventually got on the Superfund list in 1989. And that really brought a lot of notoriety and focus on what was going on out here. Over the previous years, we had started to investigate groundwater in the Schuman Valley and Falmouth and other areas, and we're finding evidence of solvents and fuels in groundwater. There were homes that were on private wells as their only source of water. Testing was done. Some of those homes needed to be put on bottled water and municipal connections. That happened in Mashpee, in the Briarwood neighborhood, and also in the Schuman Valley. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of homes. And then, as we got into the 90s, that's when you mentioned, involving the community. It's much better today. It was very painful back in the 80s when I first started. And even in the 90s, when you first
Absolutely.
started, it was a learning curve for us. When I started doing this, it wasn't community involvement. It was public affairs. And there's a difference.
There absolutely is, and I could speak personally to this
Right.
because I have a degree in marketing from Babson, and I wanted to get in the environmental world. But business was business back then, and you didn't have environmental topics in business school, and I ended up working on the recycling committee. It led to my whole career with the town of Bourne and what we have with solid waste here. But during that period, I got a job investigating possibilities for the town of Bourne by visiting Waste Management's facility, which is a major company in the solid waste world, in New Hampshire. And they had a public affairs position available, and then I put in a proposal, and really I became a community relations person for Waste Management, similar to what you're doing for the cleanup, but for a solid waste company.
Right.
Community relations was brand spanking new. There was the public relations, which is a push message. You put out
Exactly. Yep.
your information. Community involvement, community relations is really the inverse, where you're out listening what your impact is. And it was a whole new thing in the early 90s.
And the transition from what it was to what it is now was long.
And let's be honest,
Yeah.
the military, the last bastion of sort of sovereign immunity
Right.
of the federal government, and this went on, we have to acknowledge this, in the 80s and into the early 90s, kind of a bunker mentality with the military. Hey, don't come out here. We're taking care of this. This is not, the federal government actually claims sovereign immunity in some cases, that a law applying Superfund to the own federal government didn't happen until the early 90s, as I understand it. So there was still some institutional resistance, not saying you guys, but some of the military commanders. It was somehow the community was coming onto their base and getting involved in their business in a way it hadn't for years, because decades and decades the military did pretty much whatever they wanted out there. And this was the first intersection of that tension. And you were at the front lines of that in the early 80s and even into the 90s. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it was very stressful for everybody involved. We had, in the early 90s, we had countless meetings. We used to have 2 meetings a week for years on end. And, the good thing is that the military finally realized that they couldn't just do it alone. They needed to fully involve the community and not just tell them what's going on and this is what we're going to do. Actually asking someone, what do you think about this, getting their ideas, considering it in the final decision, and then implementing, the cleanup if that's what the decision is. The very first, we had something, but it really wasn't a community, involvement team, advisory team in the 80s. In the 90s, though, we created a task force to look at a Schuman and Johns Pond we're going to do fish testing and all that. Yeah, that was really the first big step for the military to engage, the vocal activists, environmentalists, the regulators, anybody, fisheries and wildlife, bring everybody to the table. This is what we're concerned about. This is what we want to do. We came up with a plan to test fish, and that carried on to what you became involved with, the public information team and the plume cleanup team and innovative technologies, all those other teams that were created back then. And out of the plume cleanup team came a plan in 1995 that the team, along with the military, put together for addressing all the plumes, and started to design it, started to look at getting close, 60% done, and then all of a sudden the infamous 60% design, and it was, all of a sudden the red flag started going up, having a pump, I don't know how many millions of gallons, 30 million gallons a day, and it's going to potentially draw down rivers and ponds.
Just so we explain what that means is the way when contamination gets in the ground, goes through the soils,
we have
a plume. Rose, why don't you explain what a plume is when we talk about plumes? We got a shot of this. Do you have a pointer? I think maybe you can just kind of walk us through what it is we're talking about. This is a typical cross section. So we're looking at a slice vertically from ground level down into the groundwater.
Yeah, so a plume is an area of groundwater contamination. Contamination is defined by any of the contaminants of concern that are identified for a plume. Like, for example, this plume is FS28, which is fuel spill 28. And this is called a conceptual site model, where it helps us understand where the contamination is in the ground and where, if we're going to do some sort of active treatment like pump and treat that we do on the base and off the base, where we would put the extraction wells in, and all this data that's collected. These colors here represent different concentrations of the contaminant, and you could see that where the plume starts, the area of contamination starts generally at the water table, and as it flows down gradient, so this would represent down gradient, you get freshwater lens building up on top of it, so that you end up having, it's like a diving situation here. So the plume gets deeper as it gets further away from the source, and that's something that this program discovered, understood by the late 90s, I would say, and it's effective in also explaining it to the public, as well as showing them, okay, here's where the land surface is, here's where the water table is, and here's where the contamination is, and here's what we're doing about it. So that's this type. In this particular case, it's ethylene dibromide, which is an additive to fuel.
And this helps people understand is that our drinking water comes from the same areas where contaminants were in the ground. And so ground seems solid. I don't understand. Well, what happens actually, there's a river, if you will, very slow moving water. It's all underneath in our soils. And we have sandy soils on the Cape. So anything that hits the sand and percolates down vertically will hit that layer and get carried in with the water, right?
Mostly sand,
Yeah, it's mostly it's more like a sponge. Because you have a lot of the soil, the lithology as we call it, and it holds the water. And the water does move, and in our case it moves about 1 to 2 feet per day. So the image of a river makes it seem like it's moving much faster, when in reality it's more like a
exaggeration. But everything does travel down gradient, downhill to the ocean. So everything flows eventually out.
And they tend, as it's moving away 1 to 2 feet per day, it tends to get deeper
Right.
in the aquifer, unless it's
Right, which
influenced
is
by a river
demonstrated
or
by
the
that.
ocean
So-
or a pond.
Trying to find where people penetrate that vertical space and pull drinking water from is absolutely critical,
That's
so
right.
that we don't drink contaminated water. And anticipating that and modeling how it moves. This is knowledge base that's been built up for 20, 25, 30
Right.
years here.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's invaluable nationally, the modeling that has been done, the lithology. Some of the most important work in the country has been done in this area. It's an amazing thing. And I'll share a story with you, Doug. You mentioned the nascent days of community outreach. The reason I joined the cleanup team, I think I've told you the story, is that front page of the Bourne Enterprise, there are people in white suits with caution tape around a playground in Katomet.
Yeah.
We're an area where the landfill 1 plume was coming from an old dump at the base into the neighborhood, and they were drilling out in that region, and the community was stunned. They really weren't clear of what was going on. It scared people. What does this mean for my kids? Can they play in the playground? There was just this shock to the community that we're not hydrogeologists, we're not chemical engineers, we don't deal with this every day, you assume it's okay.
Right.
What are the risks in sorting through what is truly a concern from maybe what is not a concern? And that was the 90s, kind of sorting through all those, because you're actually trying to get the thing cleaned up.
Right.
But it happens to be that because it's off the military boundaries of the base, it's in the neighborhoods. So you have to deal with, we're going to bring a big drill rig into your neighborhood, and this is what it means.
Exactly.
You're the front line guy, Doug, on that. You have to knock on doors. What's that like for you? What's it been like?
It's a very rewarding experience most of the time. Most people are supportive of the work that we're doing. You always run into somebody who's very wary of the federal government or doesn't want to listen, but I found that some people know a lot about what's going on at the base in terms of the cleanup, and some people that had no idea. But at the end of the conversation, they're very thankful that I'm knocking on their door and talking to them.
And that's
face to
community
face.
relations.
Yes.
Because it's not, well, I didn't see some flyer in a bulletin board or an article. That personal communication, it's a lot of work. You've talked to thousands and thousands of homeowners, I'm
Right.
sure.
Oh, yeah.
But they do talk to their neighbors, and it does put it in a perspective. One of the things that I was always concerned about is focusing where people should be concerned and separating it from where they don't need to be concerned. Not everything is a catastrophe. This is where there is pollution, and what you're doing about it to protect human health and the environment. That was always first.
That's, what I do when I talk to people, whether it's face-to-face, on the phone, or by email, is I tell them what I know, because I deal with all kinds of people, regulatory agencies, public health officials, the technical staff, that we have available to us, and I've been doing this for a long time, so I have a lot of knowledge, but I'm not an expert in public health, but I know a lot about it. And I tell them what my opinion is, and at the end of the conversation, I always tell them, or suggest to them, that they, consult other people. Call the DEP, the federal EPA, talk to your Board of Health agent, call the Department of Public Health. They're very supportive and will help answer any questions or concerns that you have, because I'm not all-knowing, and I don't purport to be. But I want people to have information, and if they have enough information, then they can make a good decision about whatever they're concerned about, whether it's swimming in a pond, buying a house, or whatever.
And there were a lot of sheets that we created back in the 90s to explain
Right.
a lot of this.
Yep.
A lot of big meetings.
Yeah. You mean fact sheets?
Fact sheets, yes.
Yeah,
And this
handouts,
is
yeah.
also an important point. When a new federal law applied Superfund to the federal government, and really the federal government became as though it were responding like a corporation, and they had oversight by other agencies. So the federal government is the responsible party here, different parts of it, and it gets to be kind of complex and has to do with what types of contaminants we're talking about, which law, and it gets really involved, and there's a lot of lawyers involved in this site, as you know. But you're overseen by the Environmental Protection Agency,
Right.
the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, the Cape Cod Commission, the boards of health, the conservation commissions in every town. It's not as though you're the master of the entire domain and you report
We do
to
whatever
others.
we want.
Right.
Yeah.
You can't. I mean, there was some of that way back in the day. That isn't the case now.
No.
So when we have a team meeting, sitting at the table, there's the public, which I represent. I don't represent the town. I represent a person in Monument Beach that goes and has an interest in this.
Sure.
But there's the EPA and there's the DEP, and sometimes it's the Agency for Toxic Substance Disease Registry, the
Yep.
Department of Public Health, and there's no punches pulled. I mean, it's, I ask tough questions because people want tough questions to be asked. But I would also say that it's been a good relationship where it's a give and take, because you have so much knowledge going on in your head and you can sort through the risks up and down, but you're a chemical engineer and you've been doing this 35 years. You can sort through pretty quickly what's a risk, what's not a risk. I'm not. So,
Right. So how do we communicate
it's a scary
that?
thing
Yeah.
to see, it's just a drill rig going in and just putting in some monitoring
Right.
wells. What's the
Yeah.
big deal?
Right.
We're going to put a recirculating well in your playground, and it's good. This is a good thing, folks.
Yeah.
Is it? I don't know.
Yeah.
It scares the crap out of me.
So,
'Cause-
so you're right. I do. We work with this all the time, but I always think one thing. I'm like, well, what would my mom think? Because she doesn't know anything about what I do.
Right.
So I try to put my mom hat on and go, well, how would my mom feel if we just drove into the neighborhood and started putting a direct push in, right? So
Yeah.
that helps me. That keeps me grounded.
And that's a great perspective to have, because unfortunately, and this is something that I emphasize with the Army, because this is mainly, we're talking about the Air Force side, you're the Air Force side, there's a whole other Army side, which the Army was a little late to the game, I would say. They were a little more resistant to look at Camp Edwards and the unexploded ordnance. And so we had to push very, very hard. And I kept trying to tell them, there's no way around this, the community. Every which way you try to solve this, you're going to have to go through the community. Learn, talk to Doug and the RPMs at the time. One of my first guests was Jim Snyder, who was the first RPM, and then
Right.
Robert Gill.
Right. Yeah.
And
John Davis.
John Davis.
Yeah.
These are your predecessors that were, Jim Snyder especially was at that front line intersection of all these tensions. And there's no way around the community, because it had been decades since some of the sources of this pollution started. It had worked its way into the neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So there's no way, there was no magic boundary at Mass Military Reservation Joint Base
Exactly.
Cape Cod where the pollution stopped.
Yeah.
It kept going.
Right. But a lot of people who live in, well, a lot of people who work on the base anyway, they live in the community too. So they're community members. And the base has often been called like the Cape's other community, right? So
It absolutely is.
we all live and work together.
Right. This is why this was groundbreaking in a number of ways.
Yeah.
And it got a lot of national attention with groups from Center for Public Environmental Oversight out of San Francisco, came all the way out here. It had representatives because they were doing cleanup programs out at the Presidio in San Francisco. National major, and this has affected, what happened here has affected cleanups in military bases around the country, and I'm sure around the world eventually.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of crazy, but
No, you're right. When I was working in Michigan at Ward-Smith Air Force Base, I remember hearing about the cranberry bogs here on the Cape, and I was like, where in the world is that? And here I am.
Right. And having Ted Kennedy as our senator, and John Kerry to a lesser extent, but Ted Kennedy, obviously a high-profile senator, sitting at a public meeting, what are we going to do about this, Air Force? It brought a lot of attention. And I
Sure.
think that's a good thing. And there were some very ardent activists that were very upset about this, as they rightfully should have been. There's always a balance between, okay, we heard you, now we got to actually do it. And that involves a lot of groundwork that you have involved in.
Yeah, the amount of anger from the community and mistrust and the constant, having stuff in the paper, I think, without all those people getting involved and voicing their opinions and their concerns, we might not have gotten all the funding that we've received.
Right.
We've received everything that we've requested all
amazing.
through the years, and it is amazing. Some bases, they don't get everything.
Right.
But this is a sole source aquifer.
High profile.
It's high profile. It's a tourist industry. It's Cape Cod. And people cherish that, and it's something to be protected. And in the case of the base and all the pollution, it needs to be addressed. And we're in the process of doing that. And as we're going to talk about in a little bit, we thought we were pretty much done with the cleanup. Just keep operating. The systems are all built, decisions all made. But now we've found that we're into something else now related to firefighting foam.
Well, and the money it's spent, it's well over $1 billion that will have been spent
Oh, yeah.
by the time this is done, because these are decades of cleanup. I had argued that this is an investment that others can learn from, and one of the things that I kept stressing to the community involvement team is that please share this with the Navy, share it with the Army, share it with the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard. We're not the only base that has these issues. Hopefully DOD gets it, and now Department of Homeland Security. I think they get it now, and they're much more open. Again, if you're a military commander from the 80s, a colonel running the commander out there, I met him, and he opened up the base for a tour. I was the only person that showed up.
Wow.
You know, I think you probably know. But there was still that kind of, this is our domain, you know, don't come in here and tell us exactly, you know, they're used to running their own show and being obviously somewhat secretive. It's a military base. You're not, not everybody gets access to everything. It's not the way it works. It's not the way it should work in some cases. But now you have the entire community with a microscope on your operations. It's an uncomfortable feeling. And it was a transition. Now I think there's a whole new cadre of officers who've come up probably in the last 25 years that have learned this as part of their training, I would think.
Sure.
Yeah. Have you seen that working?
Or just interacting.
Yeah.
I mean, General Foe, who's the executive director of the base now, he lives in Falmouth, right? So he cares about the community, and you know, it's not like that anymore. There's so much public involvement going on the base. You know, the MCQ.
Funny story, you don't know that I grew up with General Foe.
Oh, you did.
In Hanover. Funny how lives come around intersecting. Just to put it in perspective too, we're talking about the Installation Restoration Program, which is the Air Force side, which is typically the southern runway area, all those installations down there. Camp Edwards, which is the woods, if you will, in the north, is the Impact Area Groundwater Study Program. That's the Army side.
Right.
We're not going to talk about that, but that's the unexploded ordnance when they used to fire the shells. Ironically, they located the impact area where they fired those shells at the worst possible spot, because they had the glacial moraine where nice and high, you can look and see the shells landing down, observation points, but of course all the water drained right into that spot.
That's where the groundwater mound is for the aquifer.
So all the water, you know, starts right where they're firing the shells. So they have a separate program. To the extent that we can talk about them in large plume maps at these joint meetings now, the Joint Base Cape Cod cleanup team, we talk about both programs. We have both players. You're in charge of one section. You have a corollary, Ben Gregson, who does the Army side, but we have joint meetings. So because I kept emphasizing the base, there's not a magic line, pollution, it's green Army and blue Air Force. I mean, you're all dealing with the same community folks, so it made sense to combine the programs at some point. At one point it was completely separate with different meetings, different groups. So when I talk about Bourne, so what I want to do is perhaps if we could go to the slide that shows sources of contamination historically. So we have some pictures we're going to show you. So the first picture is typical sources of contamination, and perhaps Doug, you could just walk us through what we're looking at here.
Yeah, on the top left you can see barracks under construction. This was in the 1940s to support our efforts overseas for World War II. And during the 1940s there were actually over 70,000 people that lived and worked out at the base. And you can imagine that number of people and everything that was used out there, and there were no regulations in place. People were using all kinds of things, solvents and fuels, getting disposed of wherever you didn't need them if you were done with them. There were aircraft hangars where there were spills. In the bottom left-hand corner there are two photos. One you see some gentlemen pouring liquids onto the ground, and then it's set on fire, and the fire department is practicing putting it out. Great training for the base fire department and other fire departments around the base that came out. But unfortunately, for many years it wasn't a lined pit, so it's just sandy soil. A lot of it got in there. So you would have the fuels and the solvents that were dumped there, not all of it burned up, got into the aquifer and started moving at 1 to 2 feet per day, forming the Schuman Valley Groundwater Plume in Falmouth. But also more recently, you know, where you see the foam that they're using there, that's...
And that's a key picture, because we're going to talk about what that foam is and how it's affecting the community.
Right, so that's what we've been working on for the last 4.5, 5 years, the chemicals that are in that firefighting foam. And then on the bottom right, there's a missile that's one of the Bomark missiles used back in the 60s and early 70s, the missile defense against aircraft, the Soviet air bombers that used to fly up and down the coast if they needed to. In the middle there's the wastewater treatment plant infiltration beds where all kinds of stuff would just pour down the drain, got into there, another source of the Schuman Valley plume. And then on the far right in the middle there, underground storage tanks made of steel, put steel with water and you get rust and lots of leaks and stuff.
There was a pipe from the canal where they transported fuel X number of miles in a pipeline that got breached when someone dug it up.
There was a report in 1972 of a break in that pipeline over near, just north of Snake Pond, at the base, near the base boundary. It was reported that, I don't know, just a couple of thousand gallons, I think 2,000. And then when we went out and took a look years later as part of the program, we estimated that there was probably 70,000 gallons of fuel that had been spilled there. We found pure product, 70 feet below ground surface.
So it's separated because of the different densities compared to groundwater, and so you had a layer of pure jet fuel above drinking. I mean, just amazing.
Yeah, fuel is lighter than water, so it floats. So it's called an LNAPL, light non-aqueous fuel liquid.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So those are the types of sources that were the major focus of the program for a long, long, long time. And then it was solvents and additives and fuel for the aviation gasoline that made it anti-knock because it wasn't jet fuel, it was aviation gasoline, that was ethylene dibromide. Solvents, which would be trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, which are cleaning, degreasing all the parts and mechanics garages, the old dump out there where everybody just can online dump like every town had. It wasn't just the base. Falmouth, Bourne, everybody. The Beaumark missile had chemicals for the propellants there. So all of these areas then fanned out all over the 4 towns through the aquifer, and the last 20 years has been identifying where they're going, putting treatment systems in. We're going to take a look at what those look like. And then it came to a point where we were very quiet on the cleanup team, and do we need to have the cleanup team? We said, well, let's hang on for a while longer. Let's have a quarterly meeting at least a year. I said, just you never know, right? So the main concern, let's go to the all plumes map. If we could, we have a map of a large view of the military base where all these plumes are I'm talking about, and then we're going to zoom in on the Bourne plumes and talk about. So this is a look going from the Otis Rotary northbound, and you can see Bourne on the left, Katamet. So there's one plume there, it's Demolition Area 1, that's being investigated by the Army side. But the one down the bottom, Rose, what is that, LF1? What does that mean?
Sure, LF is landfill. The source of this groundwater contamination is that blue sort of, not really rectangular, but it's up further on the base on Connery Avenue, and that's the landfill. And Phil, you mentioned earlier that anything would be dumped in there. So it created an area of groundwater contamination, and then in 1995 we capped that landfill so that rainwater wouldn't continue to leach anything from there, and you know all about that. So, but it did create a rather large groundwater plume that extends from the landfill to the base boundary, and then beyond the base boundary in Katamet area, and the northern part of the plume off base actually upwells into Red Brook Harbor. And the southern part, which we don't define anymore, so I don't know if you've seen this new version of the plume or not, but that southern part is all below maximum contaminant levels
Well,
now.
and just talking about this for a moment, we had mentioned, well, pollution doesn't stop at the base boundary.
Right.
Well, in this case,
it does.
It does, because if you see all those little dots at the base boundary, that's where the treatment system is that stops the groundwater, pulls it into a treatment system, and puts clean water that continues to move forward down gradient. Had this been a plume map from 20 years ago, you would have seen the shell of the plume extend further south into the neighborhoods that I was talking about earlier. You still have some there, but there was treatment systems put off base too, and then nature can take care of some of the.
We didn't put any treatment systems off base for LF1. We evaluated it, remember, but then the community didn't want it in the community area.
You're correct. The treatment system we looked at was the recirculating well.
Right.
In
that was
the road.
evaluated. Yeah.
And that was an example of, well, we could put one out here,
Right.
But do you want it in the community? But what are the risks if we don't? And so LF1, you're right, is concentrated on the southern part there with the big building and all of that. And then you monitored the rest of it. And
Exactly.
because it went into the ocean fairly quickly and nobody was pulling drinking water from that area, the community said, we feel this is, and this was not without controversy, we should say. This was a very...
It was years, right?
Years of discussion,
yeah.
and it heated. Some wanted the system no matter what, and they typically didn't live in the community,
Right.
and others that lived there didn't want the
Right.
intrusion.
Right.
So that's LF1. It's pretty much well known. It's being treated.
Yeah.
It's shrinking. The contaminants are being recovered and removed, and over time, the whole length of and width of that plume is collapsed.
Exactly.
And that's
yeah.
a good news story. So from that perspective, we want to share that news. The other area, well, let's take a look at what you use to clean these systems up. So if we have the treatment plants slide, we'll take a look at what a treatment plant, maybe Rose, you can walk us through what a treatment facility is here.
Sure. So those red dots that you mentioned along the base boundary, those were extraction wells, and we have a series of those. We actually installed over 100 extraction reinjection wells in this program, 9 pump and treat systems. But this is an example of, on the left-hand side of the screen there, you have extraction wells operating. So they have pumps in them, and they target where the contamination is in the groundwater, and they pull it up, and the water's transferred over to a treatment plant. And this is one of the more complex treatment systems we have. Most of them are just carbon vessels with granular activated carbon in them. So these are about 20,000 pounds of carbon. These vessels hold that amount of carbon. That's what removes the contamination. So then once the contamination passes through the carbon, it's removed, and then the water is re-injected into the aquifer, or sometimes we put it back into infiltration trenches, or even sometimes bubblers like in the Quashnet and Quashnet River.
And we have a picture, the next slide of the treatment facility, we have actual picture of one of these being constructed. It would
Yeah,
be
I think this is the Hunter Avenue treatment facility located on base, but it's actually bringing water from miles away off base in Falmouth. Treats four plumes, but we also had added a couple plumes later on, so it treats about 6 plumes in this one treatment plant.
It's a major investment.
It is.
And this is a lot of electricity to run these systems.
Yeah.
And that brings up an interesting project that you worked on,
Right.
whereby it was pointed out that the electricity used to run these pumps, and we're talking millions and millions of gallons pumping water into the treatment plant and then pumping it back out. You know, that's not done by magic, it's electricity.
Right.
Which comes from a power plant and the grid and a mix of sources of electricity that have their own emissions. And we're putting some of the same volatile organic compounds into the air that you're actually pulling out of the groundwater.
Right.
And so people raised a question, well, can we do this a better way? Why don't you explain the initiative on a green remediation? What that
Yeah, I
means?
mean, you pretty much just covered it, but that's what it is. We wanted to do a cleaner way, better, cheaper, faster. That's our mantra out there. We want to do a cleanup better and fast as possible, and with that kind of falls into that better approach where, you know, we don't want to be contaminating the air while we're cleaning up the groundwater. So that's why we went in and we investigated renewable energy, and we were looking at solar at first, but we realized we need a lot of space to put solar to cover how much electricity we were using. Just to give you an idea of cost, it was, when we were pumping and treating 18 million gallons per day, it was $2.5 million a year just for our program, just for electricity. Not to mention
Wouldn't want to get that electric
the
bill.
indirect air emissions, right? So we
Minimum
looked,
payment, $100,000.
I know. So we ended up looking at wind energy, and we started with one wind turbine down by that landfill 1 treatment
We
facility.
have a picture of the wind turbine, and we have 2 of them out there now.
We have one at the landfill 1 treatment plant, and then 2 up by the Sagamore Bridge. So this was our first one. This is a Furlander. We have 3 total, turbines total, wind turbines. They're 1.5 megawatts each, and the 3 of them cover our program by 100%. So we're 100% offset by renewable energy in our cleanup program.
These are separate from the ones up by the radar station.
That's correct. This one's down right outside of the LF1 treatment plant on Cole Road in the southwest part of the base. The other 2 are located up by the Sagamore Bridge, along with 2 that PavePaws, the Air Force Space Command, put up. So there's a total of 5 utility scale turbines on the base.
And just to clarify, this makes electricity, goes onto the grid, and electrons are electrons, they're fungible.
They go wherever.
You don't have these electrons for your particular...
Right.
It goes into the big pool of energy, and what you're saying is that you put more into the grid than you take out.
Right.
So it's a net
So offset.
neutral, if you will.
Exactly, yeah.
It's a phenomenal accomplishment, and I know that was a lot of work.
It was a lot of work.
Wind turbines
It's still a lot of work.
have not been without controversy because mainly where they're located in neighborhoods. These are far enough away.
Right. We haven't had any complaints about our wind turbines for that reason.
That's
They are
great.
far enough. And then when you talk to folks in the communities, they think that, well, the base is a good place for the wind turbines. So it's worked out well.
Yeah. Not everywhere in the base. I'm sure the pilots out there
Well,
would
yeah,
say,
we had to be very selective in where we located the turbines, right? Because we have a military mission out there, flying mission, you have the radar mission, you have not just airplanes, but helicopters as well. So we took all that into consideration in siting these turbines.
So everything's going along great, Doug. We have a program, it's mature, it's 18 years down the road. We've identified all the major plumes. The Army side is well on its way to identifying contamination from the Army side, and there's overlap, and in fact, there's technology, those mobile treatment units that I heard about the Army side, and I put the pressure on you guys to use those on the Schuman Valley. So it's interesting synergy between the two programs. I said, why don't we bring one of those down there? This is sort of the give and take in a program. Is it you guys have a proposal, and then the neighborhood says, well, what about this or what about that?
Right.
We want this, we don't want that. It's a long conversation we could go on for many hours, of course. But the good news is that we had a excellent understanding, not a pretty good, but an excellent understanding. That being said, there's always a review, adjusting, putting a well over here, pumping a little bit. I mean, it's always this is your job every day, fine tuning on the latest data. Then what happened, Doug, with this? What is the PFAS system and what is pollution and what's that all about? It's affecting Pecasset.
As time goes by, science improves, as you know that, and the methods of testing and looking at different compounds. We didn't know that chemicals within firefighting foam might be hazardous to the human body, but many years ago it was looked at, and about 4.5, 5 years ago, the Air Force, and specifically Joint Base Cape Cod, our program, was tasked to start looking at potential exposures related to the chemicals in the foam, per and polyalkyl substances. Right? No.
Per and polyfluoro.
Fluoro. I forgot
Get
the
the
fluoro.
fluoro in there.
PFAS and PFOA, and those are two chemicals that are in a lot of household products. They're in carpet treatments, upholstery treatments. It's a compound that is very repellent to oil, to stains, and it's used if you have nonstick cookware that's several years old. You probably have that in Teflon. So people are exposed to it pretty much on a daily basis.
Most of us have some of it in our bodies.
That's what I've heard, yeah.
Already.
And it's very pervasive in the environment.
So now you're testing for this, Rose, in your regime when you test the groundwater. How are we doing on the cleanup? You're testing for this now.
Right.
This started showing up not just here, at airports, municipal, military, everybody. This became a national issue, not just Joint Base Cape Cod.
That's correct, yeah.
And so the military started looking at this. I know the Bourne Fire Department switched the foam that they use out from AFFF, aqueous film forming foam, which had this in it, to a different product that doesn't have those in it. And I've shared that with the military out there so that you don't add to the problem. But so now you've started seeing this. Can these existing plumes that have some of these contaminants in it treat PFAS?
Yeah, interesting you bring that up, because the Schuman Valley plume that was already defined and established with a pump and treat system operating on it, as well as the landfill 1 plume that we talked about earlier, both of those plumes have PFAS contamination in there. And fortunately, the treatment system that we put in to treat the chlorinated solvents also treats PFAS. So where we have PFAS, at least at LF1, it's within the existing plume footprint, and it's been treated ever since 1999 when the system started operating, but we didn't know about it then. Schuman Valley is a little bit different story. Within the plume that's been defined, it's also being removed by the extraction well that's operating there. But the other thing that's happened over to Schuman Valley is the PFAS from the fire training area has gone into the two ponds, the Schuman and Johns Pond, which are kettle holes, which are basically groundwater, and they feed the down gradient aquifer where people drink from, and it's just spread out in that area. So it's a much larger issue to deal with now, and we're still investigating
That's
that
Mashpee.
area. It's Mashpee and Bourne, or sorry, Mashpee and Falmouth.
Falmouth, okay.
Yeah.
The concern about PFAS and Bourne,
Yes.
and we have some pictures of what occurred. If we put up the spill slides,
Yeah.
maybe you can discuss what this
Sure.
is we're seeing here, this picture, and then the next one.
Sure. So we were talking about fire training area being a source of, where they use the foam being a source of PFAS. But in this case, the two slides we're going to show you, they're both rollovers that occurred from tanker trucks carrying fuel. So you can tell this is Connery Avenue, this is MacArthur Boulevard, Route 28, heading south into the Otis Rotary. And back in '97, there was a tanker truck that rolled over in the rotary there and spilled fuel, and the base fire department responded and sprayed foam on it.
So it wouldn't create a massive explosion.
That's
In fact,
right,
This
yeah.
smothers oxygen. It prevents the chain reaction with the fire needs oxygen, fuel, and
Yeah, if I can go chemistry on
Yeah.
you here, it has a hydrophobic and a hydrophilic end, so
Yep.
it positions itself right on top of the fuel and keeps the air from contacting the fuel vapors, and so it suppresses the vapors as well.
we have the other one, which is an aerial.
Yep.
There we go. That's a
So
great
this
shot.
occurred in 2000. There was the military, they were delivering fuel to the tank farm on the base, and they came around the Otis Rotary onto the base and took the turn a little bit too fast and rolled over right in the center of it. And again, the base fire department responded, and that's what you see. You see some fuel, but you also see all that white. That's all the foam that was sprayed on there to, again, prevent an explosion.
So the latest issue for the residents of Bourne, this occurred, was not part of the original treatment system network that we had for what was happening in Bourne, mainly focused on LF1. So now we have the remnants of this working its way through the groundwater into Pecasset neighborhoods. What's going on in the neighborhoods, Doug? What have you been doing?
For the last year and a half, I've been going door to door in areas where we're putting in, we call it direct push drilling, taking groundwater samples from the aquifer, trying to find exactly where this is. But one of the first things that we did, or actually the first thing that we did before we did any of that, was we knew this had happened at the Rotary. We knew we had something there. We looked down gradient, or downstream where the water was flowing from the Otis Rotary, and we worked with the the Bourne Water District and the assessor's office, and to find out who had a water account and get their addresses. And then we identified some properties that only had a private well. They didn't have a water account, so we went out and we notified them of what was going on and the fact that we wanted to test their wells.
Before
free
you go
of
any
charge.
further, the Bourne Water District is the main district affected by this whole program. And we should say that where Bourne Water District gets its water is well away from contaminants on the base. And there were 2 wells that were threatened by the landfill plume, but they're not used, or they're used sparingly, and there's monitoring.
Yeah.
But
Right.
people should understand that there are 4 main water supply wells, plus a well on the base in the
wells.
preserve up there for the water supply, where Bourne Water District gets its water. It is highly monitored,
Right.
well known where the water comes from, and it's not coming from any of the plumes. So if you're on Bourne Water District water, you're not pulling from an area of contamination. This was a major focus of the cleanup, where we're going to get our water supply and not be pulling public
Right.
water from a plume, obviously. You're talking about people that had their own private well on their property that weren't hooked up to the water district.
That's correct.
So you identified those very quickly, and what did you do?
We offered them the test, and we tested their wells as soon as we got the results back. If it was above the health advisory level established by the EPA, then they were given bottled water immediately as a short-term solution. And then we offered them a carbon filtration unit. As Rose talked about, carbon is effective at removing the PFOS and PFOA from the groundwater. And so we've installed a few of those, and we're giving bottled water, I believe, to 1 or 2 properties in Pecasset. But we didn't find a lot of properties, which was a good thing. As you said, municipal water is regulated, it's tested. People should not be concerned about this firefighting foam affecting that supply because it comes from other areas. So, that's what we've been doing out at Pecasset and other areas too, in Schuman Valley, in Falmouth, and also Mashpee.
And one of the things, we had a meeting of the team recently, and there were a lot of folks from Pecasset, so I hope you watch the show and this is helpful to you. And I said this at the meeting, and I want folks to understand, new technology reveals new contaminants that we always are monitoring this program. This is going to be going on for decades. It's not like, oh, we finished, we're done. These systems keep going, we're evaluating them.
It's an evolution.
It's an evolution.
Of knowledge.
Right.
And application.
And so this is not just, this is nationwide.
Yeah.
The good news, as I see it, from a member in the community who's been working on this a while, is that this isn't 1990 anymore. This isn't 1993 where, again, the military was just getting its feet wet with dealing with community relations. There was just a federal law applying Superfund to military bases in 1992. Around that time frame, we're well beyond all of those basic sort of fundamental building blocks of a cleanup program. We have community involvement, outreach, two-way communication. Right. Engineering has gotten better, science has gotten better. We know the groundwater models, we have computer models. So when something like this comes around, you're not starting from scratch.
Right.
You pretty quickly can identify what's going on.
Yeah.
So those in Pecasset are affected by this, have concerns about it. Doug, what's your phone number if they want to reach out to you?
My phone number is 508-524-9206. Again, 508-524-9206.
That's your cell phone?
Yes, that's fine.
And there is a meeting coming up in Pecasset. One of the topics of that meeting will be this issue. The other one will be Demolition Area 1, which is the Army side. It's a joint meeting, and that will be on December 5th, 6 to 8 p.m. at the Pecasset Community Center, 314 Barlow's Landing Road, right across from the fire station, which is a great location. So this is what we did back in the day. We'd have meetings in the community, not just on the base. There was a lot of criticism. You're only having meetings on the base. I don't have a military ID. I got to go through a checkpoint to get on the base. It's intimidating. Can you have a meeting in the communities?
Yeah, we felt that type of meeting would be appropriate because of all the interaction I was having, the questions that I was getting one-on-one. Plus, you mentioned that meeting earlier this year where a lot of people came, and they,
it's
they
really
were concerned
and I'm glad you're doing
didn't have the information.
Yeah.
And that's the key for this meeting.
Because some people will come to a meeting down the street in Pecasset, but I got to go on the base, and they're going to take my picture, and they got military guards there. It's a mystery. It's not something that everybody goes out there because after 9/11, you can't just drive around the base anymore. Right? Yeah. I had an ID for a long time. So again, that's on December 5th, Pecasset Community Center, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. This plume will be talked about. And so, what is the general prognosis of Rose with the contamination of Pecasset? You're studying this. You have a good idea of where the lens is of the pollution?
Right. So as Doug mentioned earlier, all the direct push work we were doing out there, combined with sampling of available monitoring wells, we've pieced it together, so to speak, and we've defined a groundwater plume now. So it basically extends from the source areas that we talked about earlier, where those fuel tanker truck rollovers happened with this foam. So it extends from there all the way down through Pecasset out to Hen Cove. So
eventually gets to the ocean.
It does, yeah. We were down on Shore Road, and it's down there above the health advisory. Now, I should say there's no federally regulated maximum contaminant level for these contaminants. It's a health advisory. So it's a little bit decisions that we make going forward after remedial investigations complete, like feasibility studies and records of decision. We don't have a number to compare that to for making ultimate remediation decisions.
And this is the nuts and bolts of what you deal with every day. Just to explain to folks, money comes from Congress that's derived under legal authority to spend it for certain things, for certain types of contamination, to meet certain laws, state and federal, for particular contaminants such as chlorinated solvents, and they triggered state cleanup standards, and the state gets involved. There's agreements that say, okay, you do that and we'll accept it as treatment or addressing our laws. Then you have a budget for that. And however, when you get into PFAS, there really hasn't been a maximum contamination level by law
Right.
that says this is what you have to clean up to. It's an advisory, and it's in the parts per quadrillion.
Right.
Nanograms per liter.
It's 70 nanograms per liter.
That's one
Yeah.
in 1 quadrillion, 70 quadrillionths. That's pretty small.
It's small.
That being said, it doesn't mean it isn't a concern.
Right.
The detection equipment is unbelievable now. What I find fascinating, this is where the lawyers get involved. There's federal lawyers, state lawyers. Who's responsible? In this case, it was fuel on the way to be delivered to the military base.
Well, the other one was going to the Steamship Authority.
Okay, but
Yeah.
the base responded.
That's right.
With the fire team, and it was their foam that was. So they did a great thing to save people's lives.
Right.
But because the foam came from the base, it pulled in responsibility by the Air Force.
Exactly.
And in some respects, that's a good thing for the people in Pecasset because the Air Force is a major, federal agency that has resources. Now, part of what I am pushing on the outside is, and I grilled you on this at the last meeting, is that the Air National Guard is paying for some of this, not the big Air Force. And it depends on who, when, and there's a lot of legal layers to this, and we
Yeah.
don't need to go there because
Right.
it's very complex. But what that manifests as is that General Foe, who is the wing commander in charge of air for the Air National Guard, is one of his hats, is spending operations and maintenance money on investigations for groundwater contamination. Money for running the jets, flying missions is being diverted to do groundwater investigation.
Yeah.
I don't think that's right. I'm working to help him get money or separate that and get you money from a different pot of money.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you're not holding any back. You're doing it. He's doing it. But really, the two don't mix.
Well, I just want to clarify that
Yeah.
that's a recent change.
Yeah.
The work we're doing out there now in Pecasset with the tanker truck rollover site, that's DERA funded because we had awarded that prior to the
Department
decision.
Environmental Defense Environmental Restoration Act.
Restoration account.
That's
So
the
that's
account,
the money
okay.
that you were thinking of, and only recently did it switch over to O&M, operations and maintenance money.
Okay.
So the work that's going on is still DERA funded because that was awarded prior to the decision.
So what is coming from?
But going forward,
Going forward.
it's going to have to be Air National Guard O&M funds.
When you say going forward, at what point do they take that?
From basically the decision was made in November 2017, so any contracts awarded after that had to be Air National Guard O&M funds.
Well, we could
Yeah.
go on for hours, and that's something I'm working on to try
Yeah.
to separate that
Yeah,
because
yeah.
that's not appropriate to have operation maintenance money for investigations. What is the military's website? MMR.org?
No, it's actually Mass National Guard, all together, MASS National Guard.org/JBCC for Joint Base Cape Cod, and then it's AFCEC.
Google it, you'll find it. The meeting's on December 5th in Pecasset, 6 to 8 at the Community Center. I want to thank you both for coming on the show. We could literally talk for about 4 more hours
We
here.
could.
Please feel free to get involved in your community. For those of you in Pecasset, I hope this was helpful to at least give you an introduction to what is going on in your community and put it in perspective for you. Certainly Doug is available to for a call and explain it to you one-on-one. That's what you do for
Absolutely.
Communications. Rose, thank you for all you do. Doug, thank you for all you do. Have a wonderful holiday season, everybody. Thank you for watching. Good night.